Welcome to CPG, the Cannabis Packaged Goods Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
In this episode of the Cannabis Packaged Goods Podcast, I had the privilege of speaking with Angela Pai, the Chief Marketing Officer at CannaCraft. We talked about her entrance into the cannabis world from the agency world, CannaCraft's brand portfolio, and their latest, Jim and Jane, a low-dose beverage targeting a female audience. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So it's great to be here with you today, Angela. Really appreciate your time. I want to start with your background. You have an extensive background with agency work for brands, and so I'd love to hear kind of how brand building, in kind of the traditional world translates into this emerging cannabis world from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. Really excited to be here to have this conversation. Now that you're speaking to a marketer, for me, I did start my career in the agency world on global brands. So I worked across North America, in Asia, in Europe, and have been in California for probably about 18 years. And throughout all of it, as we think about brand building, the agency world and the cannabis world are two very high octane type cultures. So it tends to attract these very dynamic people into people who love to work really fast, who like high intensity, and are willing to be very agile to be able to adjust to new changes. And I think it kind of shapes me to be quite excited to be in the cannabis industry, bringing together a lot of new technologies as well. That we have so many tools. You've probably seen a lot of programmatic and geo-targeting and AI going into cannabis. So it's an exciting time.
Yeah, for sure. And so you made the jump back in 2019, starting at Papa & Barkley, also a well-known brand, and now you're with CannaCraft. So what drove that jump, and how has it been? Has it been up to your expectations? Is the industry what you thought it would be? Is it a bit different than what you thought it might be?
Well, I feel I got an easy way in with Papa & Barkley because the brand has a very true and authentic origin story. So when you go into learning an industry through a storytelling brand, where you are connecting emotively with an audience about the founder's story and how, a company that's built its business on caring for the ones that they love, it's, almost like a holy grail in terms of CPG. You need that true, authentic story that connects to the heart with efficacious products that are widely distributed. So it's like check, check, check. So I feel really fortunate that I was able to get into cannabis through wellness. I also think that if with a category that's growing or an industry that's growing, 40, 50% since, year over year, and you're looking at bringing new consumers into the industry, having an emotive story and having products in wellness helps bring them into a product lineup that's just not as intimidating. So they're not getting right into rec. They're actually saying, oh, this topical doesn't get me high. Oh, maybe I should try something that's going to help me sleep, or a tincture that's going to help me reduce my anxiety and get through the day.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the interesting nuances about cannabis, particularly adult use cannabis, is that it goes beyond recreational, right? There's the whole wellness component. And I know we'll talk a bit about the different brands under CannaCraft, because I know you do have a sizable portfolio, I think, on both sides of that. So it'll be kind of interesting to hear some perspective there. But before we dive into that, I know, with your background, I saw a lot of B2B and also direct to consumer. And, you guys are in California there at CannaCraft, and California is pretty unique in the sense that there's opportunities for direct-to-consumer brand play, and that's not the case in every market. Like, I'm actually up here in Seattle, and in Washington State, there's no delivery, there's no direct-to-consumer model, and I think it's it's kind of disappointing because I think it opens up a whole host of opportunities. So with your background in B2B and direct-to-consumer, how have you been able to leverage that, at CannaCraft with some of the brands there?
Yeah, well, coming in from fashion into the cannabis space, where your direct-to-consumer, your e-com experience in terms of overall user experience is really critical, while at the same time looking at how you're building relevance with your B2B customers. So taking that type of learning into the cannabis space, especially in 2020 with COVID, brands weren't as quickly to adopt delivery and e-commerce as other industries, because there was a certain amount of financial or capital investment to be able to build the technology. But because of COVID and, we all needed to be at home, just the acceleration of digital marketing, e-commerce, and at-home delivery help accelerate a lot of that consumer behavior, which then push brands and companies to build up that aspect of their overall customer experience. So I think because of COVID and because of us being stuck at home, that pushed us forward technologically in a way that we would not have it expected. Because if you think about people walking into a dispensary, you think about foot traffic, you think about shelf presence, you think about the influenced decision-making through a bud tender. But we didn't really have that when we were predominantly at home. So I think that is one of these unexpected situations that had a positive outcome in terms of pushing our business forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know with COVID, there's been conversations around how it's accelerated a lot of trends that we knew were coming, but kind of forced us into it, which is exactly that, kind of this online shopping, purchasing ahead, picking up, or getting it delivered. So it's great that you're able to leverage that, with CannaCraft. There's some real advantages to having a connection to the consumer, and it's almost like the retailers, will know kind of trends, or they'll be able to talk to the customer, but having that kind of direct to consumer opportunity as a brand like CannaCraft, it does give you a chance to create that communication channel and to learn, more about the consumer, not have to have a retailer as kind of an intermediary there.
For sure. And if you think about the challenges of launching new products or new brands during COVID, where there isn't as much foot traffic going into stores. So how do you introduce new products into a marketplace? Then you look at what are your own channels, what are my earned channels, how I'm gonna create these opportunities for having conversations. So brands that really revved up their social channels, their email strategy, and also looking at how different types of digital advertising was able to offer consumers introductions to products and brands that they would not have heard about had they not been in the dispensary speaking to a bud tender. Yeah, no,
that's a fantastic point. And so speaking of brands, CannaCraft has a large number of notable heritage brands like Care by Design, ABX, that have been around for some time, but also new product lines like Jim and Jane, which we'll get to in a second here. Great. What kind of goes into determining your brand portfolio, and how do you guys pick, what brands, and are you happy with what you have? Are you looking at expanding into other brands? What goes on at CannaCraft with respect to your brand development?
I can spend a whole afternoon answering that question. I bet. But being cognizant of time, a couple of things, with the brands like Care by Design and ABX, these are what we would consider to be always relevant brands. We don't necessarily call them heritage brands. I think they're always relevant. And we're a company that has 11 brands and to be 13 brands in the next 3 months, including Gem and Jane. So we think about this portfolio of house of brands that has every single form factor, and from rec into wellness. We're really lucky to be able to be vertically integrated and almost 300 SKUs, if not more, in the marketplace. But the consideration of how do you look at making sure that you have a tight portfolio of products and brands, right? So on a quarterly basis, we really look at which SKUs are performing and not performing. How are we pricing? Who are we attracting into the cannabis market in terms of new to market type consumers? What are the categories that are capturing people's attention? So we would look at your data at Headset, where are people coming in to the category? And I think that's where beverages are really, really exciting, because I think you guys have projected that beverages is going to go overtake tinctures by the end of 2021. So with newcomers coming into a category, how can then we best serve them by offering a nice array of different choices? So we make those types of consideration, go through a pretty extensive R&D process and decide on are these products going to be under existing brands, or do we create new brands where they're going to live and be in and of themselves?
That's great. I always love to hear data-driven approaches. Obviously, I'm biased here at Headset, but
100%.
Yeah, no, it's the best way to do it. And thinking about new consumers and what attracts a consumer to the category, I think beverages is a great one. It's a format that people are so familiar with. And I think with all the innovation around that category, we're certainly going to see it command more and more market share, over the months and the years ahead. And it's a great transition. I did want to talk to you a bit about beverages, with CannaCraft and Lagunitas and Hi-Fi Hops. And that made a lot of headlines when that first came out, very, very early kind of, I guess, traditional, what you might consider a traditional CPG brand, Lagunitas in the beverage alcohol space, coming into the cannabis space. And there is some, in Canada, there's been some investments into Canadian LPs from alcohol brands and so on. But to really see a brand that you could buy at the grocery store or you could buy at a cannabis retailer, I think it was a pretty notable item. And you're starting to see more and more of that happening. I know brands like Pabst has a few product lines now in California. But, when I think of first, it was certainly the Lagunitas, Hi-Fi Hops brands that kind of came to market. So, I'm fascinated by kind of the overlap in traditional CPG and traditional brands and how they look at the world in the cannabis space. Do you have any insight into, how, CannaCraft or Lagunitas might see kind of collaboration, the future of the industry and brands like that coming into the category?
Yeah, can't speak for Lagunitas, but can speak for CannaCraft in terms of how we see it. Again, as a marketer, understanding who you're designing for. And if I've done my job right, I've actually changed some sort of behavior that I wanted someone to affect. So with the Lagunitas and Hi-Fi Hops is now the best-selling beverage within the category, which is excellent, which means that the product, the branding, the education that goes into talking about this cannabis-infused hop water brand means that we're doing the right thing. I think having the recognizability of Lagunitas and what it stands for in terms of craft beer was very important to establish consumer confidence. And the product being 0 calorie and gluten-free and having just enough buzz was something that people really felt attracted to. So I think it's a great proposition. And as you know, there are, a lot of people looking into an free alternative, almost like Cali Sober. Then this gives them an alternative to a beverage that gives them a hop flavor, but a cannabis infused type of effect.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a big reason why you're seeing beverage alcohol brands, the trend towards, being alcohol free, it's growing with a younger generation, just like the tobacco companies are looking at, beyond tobacco, beyond nicotine, where's the growth come from for them in the cannabis industry seems like a good parallel. And another one of your brands I wanted to touch on is the Farmer and the Felon. And, what's so interesting about the cannabis industry, and this is something that when I got involved, so long ago, I got involved in the industry because of the opportunity originally. There's an emerging category, pretty exciting, but the more you're in it, the more you learn about, the harms of prohibition and, all the problems that prohibition has caused. And it's why there's, so much talk about social equity in the cannabis space. It's why you're seeing, newer markets, emerging markets legalize with a social equity component. And even at the federal level, things like the relatively recently reintroduced MORE Act, has a big social equity component. And the Farmer and the Felon, has a great story behind it and kind of talks about that. It's one of the few brands that I've really seen kind of get in front of it from a branding, even a brand perspective. Every once in a while you'll see brands that talk about, we support this by backing groups like this, but not so prominent with the brand. So I'd love to hear, more about it and, why you think maybe more brands like Farmer and the Felon don't exist out there.
Brands who are so committed that we'll put it on our packaging.
Exactly.
Well, Farmer and Felon is only about a year old. So we launched it a little over a year ago in 2020. And with Farmer and Felon, I think it's also an origin story for us because of our co-founders. And, Ned Fussell, the farmer, and Dennis Hunter, who's the felon. Dennis Hunter was actually incarcerated and served over 6 years in prison for nonviolent crime for growing cannabis. So he's very integral to that story and our commitment to working with Last Prisoner Project to expunge sentences and release those like Michael Thompson who've suffered under cannabis criminalization. So it's a huge commitment of ours. It's not a CSR that's bolted onto a brand DNA. It's actually woven within the foundation of why we created this brand. And to the second question of why are there not as many brands that are as vocal or as integral to that, cannabis criminalization injustice. I feel that because the industry is still quite young in terms of how it's searching and creating safe access and becoming legitimate, that sometimes brands shy away from going so fully involved into decriminalization of cannabis injustices and expunging these people who underserved and also incarcerated.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I love the a lot of its authenticity, right? If your founders, at CannaCraft have that background and can carry that through into the brand, I think it's one of those things, you mentioned like your earlier before CannaCraft at Pop and Barkley and kind of talking about, brand kind of going in and having that story, kind of that narrative. And I think, CannaCraft having that story, embracing that story and then, helping change, a lot of the damage done by supporting things like Last Prisoner Project as a big piece of that and putting it front and center is great. I think a lot of consumers probably don't even realize, just like myself when I got into the industry in 2010, you knew for sure that people were going to jail for something like this, but you didn't really understand the extent of the impact of that. And I think having a brand like Farmer and the Felon, where it's, front and center and people can ask questions, what is this brand about? Why is it called Farmer and the Felon, and learn a little bit more, I think will help move the conversation along too and help even the consumer drive some of that because it feels very activist driven, very industry driven, by organizations
very mission
like yourself.
Driven and nothing to be ashamed of. That's part of your past. That's part of your history. You own it. And when I hear about Dennis's experience of when he was captured, having his child, wrenched from his arms, it's heart-wrenching.
Terrible. And, with these more and more states legalizing with federal changes on the horizon, hopefully we will see some, social equity component. But if we see legalization without that piece, it's important that, brands like Farm and the Felon exist to help, fix a lot of this stuff. So that it's a really unique brand, and I'm, surprised that there's not more, but it's great that you guys are, running ahead with that and, raising the profile and the awareness of that issue. So
with every brand that we work on, and we're developing, we look for those opportunities where we can interweave the social equity into everything that we do. With Gem and Jane, we've also done that as well in terms of working with groups who are helping entrepreneurs, especially people of color, to be able to establish businesses that they do not need to have a license, but still be an ancillary business to cannabis and still be part of, the rising tide.
Yeah, I love that. And that's a great transition to Gem and Jane, which I believe is your newest brand in the brand portfolio. And I really want to talk about it. I think that what we see at Headset is this category is growing really quickly. Obviously the beverage category, but the low THC, which, the hi-fi hops, you guys have a low THC variant of that, but this kind of seltzer-inspired beverage, might want to classify it as. But you obviously know it better than I do, and maybe you can give our listeners kind of a sense of, what is Jim and Jane, and how is it positioned?
Great. Well, I'm going to tie into two questions. One is what you were asking earlier on. How does CannaCraft decide on creating new products and brands to bring to market? So we did see from Headset a lot of the acceleration of the microdose segment of beverages.
Sure.
And that, in order for the industry to grow, you have to bring new consumers in. And consumers are coming in around microdose beverage, being kind of curious. And what's exciting about beverages is that women are actually overrepresented across all demos, but you know that because your team found that and created that sort of insight. So for us, we saw an opportunity of creating a microdose beverage specifically for women, targeting those who are actually purchasing it more. And we also know from Headset that beverages tend to be an add-on and not necessarily a destination type product. So then people who are coming in to the category of cannabis and looking for ways in which they're swapping out their glass of wine or a cocktail at the end of the night just to be able to unwind. And so we, created this brand, Gem and Jane, for women, and it's with an all-female team on the R&D, design, and marketing as a female team as well. We named it Gem and Jane because it celebrates how women are multifaceted, like jewels, and that we're brilliant from the inside out. And therefore, all of our packaging is very much in gem colors. They're very shiny. We want, and tying into behaviors, we wanted the design of the packaging to be so beautiful that people feel good holding it at a party or a gathering, and that it doesn't look weedy, right? So it looks like something that they would have, and it looks gorgeous.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. And you mentioned like the low dose kind of trend and a party environment. I think now that a lot of the stigma is going away in legal markets from cannabis consumption. There historically beverages in the beginning of legalization were always 100 milligram per bottle, in the medical days in particular, and it's quite a bit of THC, and you'd have to take just a little bit. Some companies would even include like a kind of medicine cap so you could serve it out, which is not exactly the most social experience, right? And coming in with a 2.5 milligram low THC product, it's definitely something you can have, one or two of, if not more, depending on your tolerance and a social environment. And then you have a lot of advantages that cannabis has, includes things like, no calories or lower calories, right? From alcohol, lack of a hangover. And so from like a social consumption perspective, I think, that makes a lot of sense. And you're right about the data. We do see this kind of product tends to trend a little more female. So targeting directly, I think that's super clever. And I think it'll help get you guys a lot of market share early on, especially standing out on the shelf like that. Another difference I noticed between Jim and Jane and maybe some others is kind of how you talk about the cannabis content, and you go beyond just saying 2.5 milligrams. There's other cannabinoids that are mentioned in there, like THCV, Delta 8, things that people are talking about. So what kind of drives some of that decision to go beyond just saying, hey, this is 2.5 milligrams of THC, but getting kind of more nuance? Is it about educating the consumers on, the nuance of what cannabis can be, or is it something else?
Sure. In terms of cannabis and cannabinoids, we have more than CBD and THC. We have great, minor cannabinoids like Delta 8 and THCV for the different types of effects and how it makes you feel. In designing a beverage that's sessionable, where you can have 2 or 3 without really having that level of psychoactivity, depending on your tolerance, we're looking at the cannabinoids that can give you an elevated feeling without necessarily getting you high. So with Delta 8, it gives you a softer high, and with THCV, there's very low psychoactivity, and it gives you that, sense of alertness or focus. So bringing into the market a Delta 8 and THCV beverages that are very sophisticated in terms of their palate, we feel speaks really to that female consumer who's going to swap it out for a cocktail.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think the more consumers can learn about that it's not just THC, not all THC is the same necessarily, I think is important. There's just so much learning, especially for those new consumers that you guys are bringing into the category with products like this. So another kind of, when you mentioned kind of female focus, it does remind me of when seltzers first kind of came to market in the alcohol world. I think it attracted a more female audience early on, and there was some kind of meme-friendly content that got out there. In particular, this one that was "No laws when drinking clause," which was pretty funny. There's actually some articles where, I forget where it was, but a city police group had to actually go out and say, actually, there are laws when you drink clause, because people were taking it literally in this market. But it actually seemed to expand the consumer audience, to a little more gender neutral, I think. And eventually, you got males and females consuming White Claw, where maybe there was a bit of stereotype in the beginning, right? And male seem to gravitate more towards like a beer kind of category versus a seltzer category. Do you see a future for Jim and Jane for something like that? Or do you look at other kind of properties like Lagunitas or other future things to kind of continue to bring more people into the category?
The industry is growing so rapidly, and in order to keep that momentum, you have to bring new consumers to the category. So having a product like Gem and Jane, a low dose beverage, allows them to experience cannabis without freaking out.
Right.
You don't want them to have a bad effect. You want them to actually enjoy it. Having sophisticated flavors like elderflower pear, strawberry hibiscus. These are really yummy flavors that they would be accustomed to in a cocktail type of environment.
Sure.
So they go, ooh, that sounds really yummy. I want to try it. And they have a positive experience with it. Then they would probably be willing to try a few more things. I think that initial experience is very critical. Like, how did you feel? Did it scare you off, or did it actually interest you in being curious about other products, trying an edible, and adding some tincture into your wellness regime, and then going into perhaps higher doses of THC for more of an effect, or more of an elevated effect? Yeah,
no, that makes a lot of sense. Another thing I want to touch on is pricing for things like this. And you mentioned, going into brand building, you're data driven, looking at the numbers, and I'm sure pricing, kind of thinking about pricing for Jim and Jane and kind of margins for retailers was probably very data informed. But I also know that there's potentially challenges in the market with things like MSRP and, making sure retailers are pricing things similarly. Like, how do you guys, see that? How does that impact, CannaCraft with product launches like Jim and Jane?
We do have suggested retail pricing, and we created our wholesale pricing and any kind of promotional offers tied into what we hope the retailer or dispensary is going to pass on to the consumer as the actual pricing. And since we're on the topic about MSRP, I have to say that as someone who believes that building consumer confidence and trust in the value proposition of your product or your brand does tie into the consumer shopping experience around pricing. So in an industry that doesn't have MSRP, it makes it more challenging for consumers to decide, well, what is this worth? What is this, can of sparkling beverage, or this bottle of capsule, or this package of pre-rolls? What is it worth when I can buy it for this price a few blocks from my house, and 5 miles away it's 2.5 times more expensive? So how do you evaluate what the value proposition and the pricing of the overall consumer confidence in terms of how much is something supposed to be? So I would feel that looking into the future as our industry becomes more sophisticated, having certain benchmarks around MSRP and then passing on that price so that consumers can have a reliable benchmark of what something is worth.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. Price is, one of the 4 Ps, as they say, right? Product, price, promotion, place, and it's a big piece of it. And yeah, it's great that you guys have suggested retail price, but as a consumer, that can be quite confusing if the pricing is all over the board and you don't really know, is something just a promotional price, or, is this kind of what I should expect? Because so much of a product and a brand is tied into price, for one reason or another. So that's an interesting call out, and maybe something that, we can hope as the industry matures, we'll see more controls around things like this as things develop, because it is, still a newish market. And, these are good conversations to start having, because I feel like we're at that moment now where we're really getting more and more sophisticated. People with, extensive backgrounds like yourselves are coming into the category and saying, okay, well, in, other categories in my experience, we had a bit more control over things like this than we do in cannabis. And let's see what we can do to kind of change that for the better for the consumer. So
yeah, and as a cannabis consumer, I don't want all of, or at least the majority of the communication that I'm getting from brands or from dispensaries to be deal related. Maybe teach me something, engage me in a conversation, but more often than not, the email or the text message that's coming through is telling me about a deal. So then you have this price sensitivity of then looking for a BOGO or looking for 50% off and what else is on sale. And that's an important tool. Promotions are an important tool as part of what we do as marketers, but our communications need to be more robust.
Definitely. And yeah, consumers, I think are they have an appetite for more education, because there's so much to learn. Every day I learn about new brands, new products that didn't exist, a month or so ago. So it moves quickly, and consumers, it goes beyond, just promotion, just learning about, what makes these brands, and the stuff we were talking about with the cannabinoids and, THCV and Delta 8 and all this stuff. That'd be great kind of communication to get versus just promotional items. So this is great. I'm really excited to, hopefully get to try Jim and Jane soon, next time I'm down in California. Anything else that you'd like to highlight coming from CannaCraft, or anything to expect in the future?
We're launching new products and we're bringing new brands to market almost on a quarterly basis. And as the biggest house of brands in California, for us, we want to introduce cannabis products to new consumers, and we want our existing cannabis consumers to try more of what we've got, and we're designing for them. So as a marketer, again, it's about who you're designing for and really understanding what that consumer is looking for in terms of their overall experience, and not, just the unwinding at the end of the day, but, looking at products that we help people have more focus throughout the day, who are looking for that peak performance throughout the day, and are looking for a social product that they can enjoy with friends. So there's a lot across the board, and as a company that is really committed to bringing great products and reliable effects to market, that's something that we're going to continue to do.
Well, that's the most exciting thing about my job, is getting to see all the great innovation coming out of brands like CannaCraft. So I look forward to seeing every quarter what you guys are launching and how they do, and learning more. And I'd love to reconnect in the future and see how everything's going. So thanks again, Angela. It was a real pleasure, and learned a lot, and look forward to connecting again soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining CPG, the Cannabis Packaged Goods Podcast. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.